Hi, everyone. Welcome to another episode of The Cheeky Natives. I think today may possibly be the most exciting day of my life. I have the wonderful privilege of talking to Professor Kimberlé Crenshaw, who we all know is one of the founding scholars of critical race theory, but more importantly, who coined the term intersectionality in 1989 in a formative essay about demarginalization. And we'll speak more about that. Hi, Professor Crenshaw. How are you doing?
I'm great. How are you?
I'm doing well, thank you.
Good.
I've just some background. I've had the privilege of being in Professor Crenshaw's civil rights class, and it's been very illuminating. And this is where I'm finding myself at UCLA, where actually the program itself has been really incredible in bringing really amazing Black scholars. And Professor Crenshaw, I think one of the questions that I'm sure you're inundated with is, who is Kimberlé Crenshaw?
Actually, nobody asked me that. Kimberlé Crenshaw is a Black woman that was born on the cusp of the civil rights movement. I was raised in Ohio, that's in the Midwest, in a small steel town. My parents were both teachers. My mother was born in Canton, Ohio, and told me stories as I was growing up about her life in a quasi-segregated small Midwestern town, and partly because her father was one of the few African Americans that didn't work for the factory. He was a physician. They were relatively free from repercussions if she were to engage in demonstrations against segregation. So her earliest memory was desegregating the local kiddie pool when she was 3 years old, and after that, at various times throughout her childhood, she, would integrate the local soda fountain, the local theater, the local orchestra. So she more or less raised me as an advocate for Black equality. And my father was the son of a Methodist minister who traveled around a bit. And they were more connected to the sort of traditional church as a source of civil rights resistance and spiritual, a spiritual home. And the two of them together, raised me with those expectations. So my friends used to tease me when we would play outside, and there, inevitably came the time to come in for dinner, and my family more or less expected us to talk at the dinner table about what we had observed in the world that day. And my friends used to say, feel sorry for us because we had to study for dinner. You had to really think about, oh, gosh, what am I going to say today? And, obviously, they had in mind the idea of, Black people having to be twice as good, having to have a sensibility about the world that they occupied, having a collective sensibility. There was never a moment where I was not raised with a we, being Black people. So it was a consciousness that was deeply etched into my being from the time I was quite little. And I more or less see everything I do now as sort of seamlessly connected to that point of departure.
That's really interesting because I guess from very early on you're aware of the differences that existed in the world, and it was to conscientize you to always questions. And I'm wondering, so you went to high school in Ohio, and then what did you do when you did your undergrad? Where did you go for your undergrad?
So my undergrad, I went to Cornell University. I had known about Cornell partly because in the late 70s, Cornell was the site of one of the most widely reported Black student rebellions, largely in response to hostile environmental conditions that newly integrating Black students were experiencing in elite universities across the United States. In particular, there had been a cross burning outside of a house that housed several African American women on campus. There had also been a long brewing debate about Africana studies, the need to have some area of study that reflected not just the fact that there were new bodies there, but these bodies came out of histories and environments that required a particular a means of producing knowledge about that experience. So there have been demands that the university had resisted. So, one thing led to another, and the students ended up taking over the student union, and out of that takeover the student union came a freestanding Africana Studies program, came a dorm called Ujima, and came a commitment to deepen the ability of new non-traditional students to come to Cornell and find in that space an environment that was comfortable for them as the environment was comfortable for white folks. So I'd heard about this and decided to go and check it out, and it was pretty much what I felt I needed. Mm-hmm. So I ended up going there. I concentrated in Africana Studies and Government, and at the same time did a radio show called Black World News, where we basically took the news from the AP wire and rewrote everything from, a Pan-African perspective. That's where I kind of learned it's not so much the facts, it's the frame of the facts that tell the story. So, we practice reframing the news to highlight what the news meant for people, like us. So that more or less became, the undercurrent that I, continued to ride after I left Cornell and went to law school.
And you obviously went to Harvard for law school. And we know the history of Harvard, but more importantly, what has been interesting is what emerged in Harvard. But do you want to tell us, when you entered law school at Harvard, what that experience was like?
When I went to Harvard, well, first I have to, like all stories, there's a prequel. The prequel is this: I was very close to a young graduate student at Cornell who was getting a master's in Africana Studies, and his family in turn was close family friends with a fairly famous civil rights leader. And so we had the occasion to all have dinner at some point. And my friend's mother was keen to introduce me as a Harvard-bound civil rights lawyer. And the civil rights leader, asked me several times, Harvard? You sure it's Harvard? Harvard, many times, which I thought was a little bizarre. But then he asked me what I had majored in. Now, in my mind, I'm speaking to, at least the general of the army of racial justice advocates. So I'm thinking I'm about to sign up for duty. So I proudly say that I studied Africana Studies, and then, kind of threw in the government, but I thought that offering up, we're the same.
We're the same, yeah.
And I wasn't prepared for the response. The response was a complete repudiation of Africana Studies, of people, mentors who I held dear, of me for pursuing that degree, of my parents for allowing me to do so. I mean, I was like, where is this coming from? Right? There was this, there were a couple key moments in my professional and pre-professional life in which the we shattered. That was a moment where the we shattered. I realized that we were not at all on the same page. So he told me that I was basically going to flunk out of Harvard, that I was not prepared.
Because you studied Africana
Because I
studies.
studied Africana studies. That I should have
Which
taken.
is interesting, I suppose, for a civil rights person to take that perspective.
Interesting is one way of putting it. That's what I thought, right?
So did he say like what would have better prepared you?
Psychology, sociology, all those ancient, fields, disciplines. Those disciplines weren't ancient at all, right? And besides that, there was nothing inside those disciplines that better prepared me for the engagement that I ended up having, which was to observe the fact that integration at that point was just a matter of bringing new bodies into spaces, not rethinking what the modus operandi of the space actually was. And this is especially, important given the fact that we were talking about the discipline of law, which, across the board, even someone like this person, saw law as a central site of the racial justice struggle, but did not see law through a critical lens that sought to explain how law also constituted the very problem that otherwise law was supposedly liberating us from.
Exactly. So law creates race and race creates law. So
that's right.
Yeah.
That's right. So I went into law school, hoping to study with Derek Bell. We had gotten his book.
And just for our listeners, Professor, who is Derek Bell?
So Derek Bell was one of the first African-American law professors to be hired at Harvard Law School. He had been a lawyer for LDF, Legal Defense Fund. He had sued numerous school districts to seek integration, and eventually became a skeptic and a critic of the conventional way that law had been figured as the great savior, of Black people. So his book, Race, Racism, and American Law, was a classic text. There is a lithograph on the first page of the book that had the two Black Olympic runners who in 1968 had held up a Black Power salute at the Olympics, which of course was scandalous across the world. He put that up in his book. It was sort of like, this is like these runners. I am going to run this race, and I'm going to do it on behalf of, fully aware of, and as an expression of the need for Black liberation. So it's right in the text. And, you open that and you go, whoa, what's going to happen now,
yes.
right? And you just read this book, man. It was like 400 pages of a complete exposition of the role that law historically had played in constituting white supremacy, and the partial project of using law to dismantle it, and all of the ways that project was compromised, by existing entitlements and expectations, by ideas and structures that were incorporated into the Constitution, such that much of what constitutes white supremacy is so hardwired into our republic that it's almost impossible to dismantle it. I mean, the way that he modeled thinking and talking about the law was completely, unprecedented.
And you had encountered his work before you went to Harvard?
Yeah.
Okay.
So I had encountered, I knew he was there. yes, I'm going to Harvard to study race and law with Derek Bell, da 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 da. And the summer before I got there, he left.
Oh, goodness.
He left. Fed up with Harvard. He had been,
Naturally.
really pressing Harvard to, first of all, hire more professors of color, right? Their general sort of take on it is that there are very few that are willing and able, and those two are not the same, right? There are some who are willing and they're not able, and there's some that are able or not willing.
Yeah.
So basically, there was a pool of maybe a handful of people of color who Harvard thought
Yeah.
could come there and teach, and they weren't willing to rethink the
merits.
pool,
Yeah.
how the pool was stocked. It's sort of, I've written somewhere that they took an evolutionary approach, that eventually, just like fish eventually grew legs and walked onto, the land and became us, that's what integration would require. At some point, these fish would
just
walk out and say, here I am. No need to, rethink how to populate the pool. So when I got there along with a critical mass of other students who had also been active in campus politics, had also come out of a variety of ethnic and racial studies, and had grown up with the idea that this right to truly equitable environment was something that we had to fight for and we were obligated to fight for. So my entire period at Harvard was basically a period of protest, negotiation, trying to create alternative means to develop the area of study that we wanted.
Exactly, yeah.
While answering questions that were unanswerable because we hadn't taken the course.
Exactly.
When we went to sit down at the dean, he'd say, well, what is it that you want to learn? And we're like, that's what we're here to figure out,
I guess another interesting question, and having been in law school myself, law school can be tremendously challenging. And I suppose a lot of our listeners who may be currently in law school listening to this wants to know how Kimberlé Crenshaw survived the difficulty of law school, or whether law school was even difficult for you.
Yeah. Well, I would say it was difficult, and at the same time, it made sense to me, partly because of this exposure that I'd had, which was supposed to drum me out of law school. It actually ended up sustaining me. As folks in law school know, it's sort of like the effort is to break you down and then repurpose you, to be a lawyer. And some part of that breaking down, particularly for, members of communities that have been the object of law's coercion and ideological justification, is to lose sight of, your pre-existing commitment to yourself and your pre-existing understanding that much of what law had made possible was absolutely illegitimate, right? So having that commitment, I think, that point of departure, having my own baseline rather than the law's baseline, was a vantage point from which I could observe how law did what it did.
And I guess the conversations with your parents, you'd constantly go back to those conversations and be like, think about what this is doing.
Yeah.
So I suppose the next question is, what ultimately happened at Harvard?
Yeah.
You've written quite a lot about the events that happened at Harvard, but what ultimately, did you get the course? What happened?
Well, what ultimately happened was that the administration refused to offer Derek Bell's course, which was called Constitutional Law and Minority Issues, and resisted our demand to use that empty slot to bring in scholars from across the country who were of color and were interested in writing about race, and offered instead an alternative mini module that was being offered by two civil rights attorneys, one white, one black. The collective group of students, which by this time included not only all of the affinity groups, Black, Asian, Latinx, Native American, but also women, queer people, poor people, or people who wanted to litigate on behalf of poor people. I mean, everyone was really annoyed with Harvard. No one was being well served. So we had this big protest, and we had an alternative course. And so we pooled all our student organizational money. We identified about 12 scholars across the country and invited them each in to teach one chapter out of Derek Bell's book and to give a public lecture as a demonstration of, this is not a null set of candidates. In fact, when they say that there's a null set, these are the people that they're intentionally erasing. Right? And so that became enormously, it was a popular course. More students took our course than the administration's course. And it became the foundation, ultimately, for what emerged as critical race theory. So the people who came to lecture, they were folks that I developed a relationship with. So a few years later, I was a graduate student at Wisconsin, having continued to think about these questions. So I applied for some research funds to actually pull some people together, and the question was, what will I call this thing that we're pulling them together in? And so some part of this was clearly about race, but it wasn't just about race and practice. It was also about theory. It was about ways of theorizing racial power, even in the face of the recognition that race isn't natural. So theory was a big part of it. Race was a big part of it. We were also situated within critical legal studies, right? So it was, in fact, a progressive critical left project. So these were all the kind of words that were associated with the thing. So I just said, let's put it this, and that, right? And so the invitation went out to the professors who'd come, many of the students who had been in the class, and other folks that we kind of thought were fellow travelers. We invited people to a conference called New Developments in Critical Race Theory, as though there had been old developments. There had never been any developments in critical race theory, but you put like a red velvet rope around something and people line up. And so people ended up coming. And out of these workshops, we eventually began to see the common threads that held the work together. We were neither traditional civil rights oriented, although we believed in doing race, and we were not traditionally critical legal studies because, well, we believed in doing race from a critical lens. So that's how we eventually came together.
So essentially around that time was the foundations of critical race theory, which is a scholarship that we now recognize as being part of how we understand the relations between race, power, and the law.
Yes.
And so you finished at Harvard, and then what happened?
So I finished at Harvard, went on to the University of Wisconsin, and this is part of the critical legal studies family, because actually critical legal studies professors, mostly white professors, were enormously helpful in redistributing the capital that they had access to. So that includes passing graduate students on to other places, helping, ease us onto the market, basically vouching, for us. So, the pipeline to law professorships is very, very narrow, and especially so for people of color. So it was really helpful to have folks at Harvard and UCLA, University of Wisconsin, who were part of this broader movement, even though many times we, clashed mightily with them because
yes.
while they, and this is by far not all of them, but I think one can say that there is a way in which you can be very radical on some issues and
not.
just liberal,
Yeah.
when it comes to race. And it was odd to us because we were just applying
The teachings.
critical
exactly.
ideas to race, and they were like, "Oh, you can't do that." We're like, "Why can't you do that? You do it to class, like race. You're essentializing race to talk about. It's like you're not essentializing class to talk about the distributive dimensions of power. So why can't we do the same thing?" So even though we had these struggles, for the most part, there were some key folks in critical legal studies who actually, paved the way. So for me, Duncan Kennedy had been my third-year advisor. His advisor at Yale was David Trubeck, who was at University of Wisconsin, which was the home of Law and Society. So I just sort of went there and did my LLM. That's where I wrote Race Reform and Retrenchment, one of the first critical legal studies texts. That's where we had the critical race theory retreat. So in a way, Wisconsin is the birthplace.
And this was around 1988?
Yeah.
So, I mean, 1989 comes and something happens. And I think to backtrack a little bit, there have been a lot of feminists who had been writing. I'm thinking particularly about Audre Lorde, and I'm thinking about the women of the Kumbayi River Collective, who had been writing about this idea of how interlocking and interrelated systems of oppression work in the lives of Black women. And I guess this is an intersection to me. Who were you reading at the time that you were in law school and even in undergrad? Were there any people that you're reading?
So I was actually reading bell hooks I had read in undergrad. Discipline-wise, the most influential person for me was Deborah King, who was writing in sociology. So for me, what was really eye-opening was the disciplinary dimension of articulating a Black feminist sensibility inside of a new space.
Yeah.
I think I was able to see that the work that takes is sometimes not fully understood. It's not like Deborah was just like, I'm a Black feminist, now I'm going to do sociology. It doesn't work like that.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah.
So at each point, particularly in a deeply institutionalized, ritualistic, knowledge-producing institution, the moves that are legitimate, the kinds of subjects that can be advanced and explored are actually quite narrow.
Yes.
So the work involved is getting inside the interstices of the discipline and finding a way of re-narrativizing a set of issues within a discursive frame that's recognizable within that discipline.
Exactly.
So when Deborah King wrote her piece, it just really opened my eyes because, I was able to trace how the discipline erased the possibility of a Black feminist consciousness in it and the moves that she had to make in order to unpack it. So that was really most helpful, to me. And at the same time, what was also motivating was that even in the middle of these other struggles, like the struggle for diversity at Harvard, it was kind of clear that women of color were kind of falling through those cracks. And the actual political discourse was not inclusive of them. And the actual organizations were deeply patriarchal.
Yeah.
So I'm observing all of this stuff at the law school and recognizing that the actual law itself had nothing to say about that stuff.
Things. So I guess then that interested you to look at what some of the decisions about these two things we're saying. And we come to 1989, and in the context of the law, you introduce the term of intersectionality. And we know what a disaster has been happening on social media, what people have been saying, and what better way to speak to the woman who wrote Demarginalizing in 1989 and ask her, so Professor Crenshaw, in 1989 and today, when you wrote the piece, what were you writing about? And what does the framework, because I think people think it's a phrase, and you were developing a framework. This is a framework that will be used. We can develop other frameworks from it, but what was the framework of intersectionality?
Yeah. Well, so intersectionality was basically a tool to help make visible a set of dynamics that had been completely obscured by conventional anti-discrimination law. I'd been prompted to simply read to find out what did the law have to say about this tendency of anti-discrimination law to understand race discrimination in non-gendered terms and gender discrimination non-racial terms effectively.
Yeah.
So I started looking at cases, and I just found that, every way around it, the law didn't seem to have anticipated claims that would be made on behalf of, say, Black women. And so in one case, Black women were making a case about being discriminated against as Black women, and their argument was basically dismissed because the employer had hired Blacks and had hired women, but the Blacks were not women and the women were not Black.
Yeah.
And for them, this was enough to say that the Black women couldn't. Right. And so it was puzzling on one hand, like, who thinks that a discriminator discriminates against absolutely everybody? And if it's not absolutely everyone, it's not discrimination. I mean, that was bizarre on its own. But what was even more strange about it was the court's sort of dicta that for Black women to be able to combine these two courses of action, that somehow they would be getting an unfair preference, a benefit, a leg up, because, men who are Black can't have two bites at the apple, and women who are white can't. So why should we let you do it? And so, McKinnon has this to say about women in general. It's like, because Black women were the only ones that needed to do it in order to make an articulable claim, to give them what they needed because they were the only one that needed it was, basically preferential treatment. And I was thinking, so that's like madness. What is it that this court can't see about how race discrimination extends itself into gender inequality, or how gender inequality extends itself into racial power? Like, why is that such a complicated, concept? So, as I'm a visual thinker, and so I was, thinking, well, this is the way that the race thing is working. This is the way that the gender thing is working. So, they were employment policies that constructed the institution around race and around gender, and those things actually were interactive when it came to Black women, and the interaction of them is what completely pushed them out, right? So, and it was in the intersection that these policies converged. And so I thought, well, since these judges can't quite get the fact that this is not preferential treatment given whatever frameworks they have, we need another framework, and something really simple and easy, because it's a simple and easy issue if you actually think about it as converging patterns of subordination. But apparently they didn't have a structure to direct their thinking. So intersectionality was just that. It was a word picture to try to say, look, will it help you if I explain it to you this way?
In pictures,
Yeah.
And I think, obviously because of the difficulties of how the word has just been taken, you say something really interesting in one of the talks you speak about it. You say, it's not primarily about identity. You know, it's about how power could be used as a vehicle, as a consequence of vulnerabilities for these identities. So I think that's an important framing to get, right? That a lot of people are like, oh, because I'm white and because I'm Christian, I have an intersecting identity.
Yeah.
Which isn't about that. It's about like how these power structures intersected in the lives of black women because
Yeah.
they did experience both racism and sexism.
And at the same time, I mean, it's been the case that there have been these huge debates from all sides around intersectionality. Most time, I just try to get out of the way. But it has been fascinating how few of the arguments actually, you know, interrogate the cases that I was writing about, right?
Yes, yes.
It's like
because
it's
people
not there.
are just interrogating the whatever, but they aren't looking at, okay, this piece was set in a particular time discussing a particular thing. So how
Around
do we do
specific
that?
cases.
Yeah.
And some of the inferences that people draw from it, like, okay, well, so basically, you know, intersectionality is about, you know, just the category of black women. Well, if anyone read Demarginalizing, you know, it's clear. I talk about black women as being excluded and not being able to be included or representative of the wider class of people experiencing race discrimination or gender discrimination. I also talk about moments when, you know, they weren't able to represent themselves.
Yes.
I mean, it's sort of, you know, across the board, the capacity to deal with, you know, black women in relationship to structures that situated them in particular ways was just, you know, profound.
And I mean, I think for me, what's important is I'm writing this piece for your class, and I've had to revisit the piece again. Is that you do say I primarily center black women in this piece, which I think is something that is often overlooked. It's like the purpose of the piece was to look at how these things intersect in the lives of black women in these particular cases. And I worry about that because I feel like a lot of the time, like black women's work has been stolen, often with not citation, but also appropriated and used incorrectly. So that has been a major concern for
I
me.
call it, you know, gentrifying, you know, intersectionality. It's like we love this property right here. We're just gonna move right on in. If we could just, you know, sort of push, you know, these bodies out of it. And it's, you know, really it's the current fight. And, you know, the thing is, of course, intersectionality is a useful frame for thinking about all sorts of things, right? In the same way that, you know, good real estate is, you know, good real estate, right? The thing is, can black people still live in something that's valuable?
Yeah, exactly.
And this seems to suggest that, yeah, they're going to have to fight to be able to stay,
yeah.
in homes that they built.
Yeah, yeah. It's really insane for me. I guess, well, firstly, thank you, because I think that, especially in the paper that I'm writing, like a lot of the work that you've done have been foundational in the way that I think about anti-discrimination law, particularly in the context of South Africa, and in lifting up the voices of black women. I guess that sort of tilts the timeline a little bit, which I'll come back to. But one of the questions that I wanted to know is, obviously we've seen the rise of Black Lives Matter happening, but in particular we saw something that I wanted to talk about is two things. One, what inspired the creation of the African American Policy Forum? And two, the forum had a particular hashtag, say her name, which sort of is linked with the work that you have done as a professor. So do you mind talking about the establishment of the forum as well as say her name?
Well, the African American Policy Forum is a think tank that was co-founded with Luke Harris and myself in 2017. Our experiences in the Clarence Thomas, Anita Hill debacle that happened in 91 convinced us that there was a absolute dire need for easy to understand frameworks that showed the relationship between patriarchy and racism. We had both been involved in the Clarence Thomas hearings after Anita Hill came forward, and it was abundantly clear to us that had there been a deeper sensibility within communities, racial justice communities, about the historic role that patriarchy, sexual harassment, sexual abuse had played, it would have been harder for Clarence Thomas to denounce Anita Hill and the entire hearing as a high-tech lynching. When that happened, it was almost impossible to re-corral,
Yes,
the racial justice forces back to being against him.
exactly.
Right? And the consequences of that, I think, have been devastating. I mean, he's the fifth vote for all sorts of things that have undermined the future of civil rights, from the affirmative action cases to gutting the Voting Rights Act to gutting campaign finance reform. I mean, I think there's a real way in which that decision to support Clarence Thomas has now metastasized into 45 in the White House. I mean, this is really something that damages not only our community but the nation as a whole, and it's also something that is a constant, need to relearn that lesson, relearn the history, rethink about how we talk about racial justice and gender justice, together.
Together, yeah.
So that's why we developed the policy forum. We wanted it to be a clearinghouse for ideas, information, eventually campaigns that were designed to actually make concrete what at that point seemed to exist as just a ideological or theoretical enterprise. So we do public education on things ranging from the disparate rates of black girls being pushed out of school to the unknown fact that black women suffer from racialized state violence. Say her name.
Yeah. So then Say Her Name came, which is essentially a reaction to what has been happening. We know traditionally when we saw from 2013 Trayvon Martin and all the black men who were killed at the hands of police, that it was a narrative about black men. But there were stories about black women who were also dying at the hands of police.
Yeah.
So Say Her Name was effectively lifting up the voices of these women and
Yes.
saying, well, actually, black women are also dying and dying at this proportionate rates, so
Disproportionate rates to their representation in the population. So, yeah, and Say Her Name was meant not as a diversion from Black Lives Matter, but as an integration into Black Lives Matter.
Yeah.
Like, yes, Black Lives Matter, and that includes black women who are also, killed by the police. And some of those black women that we hold up were killed within 10 days of the men and boys we've held up. Tanisha Anderson was killed within, 10 days of Tamir Rice. And people still don't know, that case. And it extends even, within the last month. A black woman was killed, a black man was killed, both by the police within less than 10 days of each other. One case has, rightfully spurred, protest again. The other one is just basically, silence.
So it's important for us to have Say Her Name because,
Yes.
we want to say that these things are not mutually exclusive. They exist in tandem.
But power has a way of reflexively snapping back to where it is. So now, Say Her Name has been, appropriated and turned into Say His Name. Yeah. So, it's like, his name had already been said.
Yeah.
That's why we're saying Say Her Name.
Yeah.
So that's happening, across the board.
But I guess it brings us back to demarginalizing in 1989, how important it was. It was like, we're not saying that these things cannot exist. We're saying that these things have already existed, but they existed at the exclusion of, and we're just trying to bring people into the conversation. But it's important when we say Black Lives Matter, we include every black life.
Yep.
And so I want to go back to, I guess, post-1989. the early 90s. I don't think a lot of people know this, but something interesting that I know that I found out is that you also were really instrumental in as a group of lawyers who went to South Africa to give expert advice about how to structure the Constitution based on the history of civil rights. Do you mind talking to us about your experience in South Africa?
Ooh, so, it was a life-altering experience to have been part of those conversations. I think the early part of the conversations began when the equality clause was being discussed, and I was invited to speak with at a conference where some of the drafters were in attendance, and on that issue it was more about the intersectional implications of how the different grounds for protection would be articulated. So, looking at how saying race or gender was one of the reasons why some of the cases that I was talking about earlier come out that way.
Exactly.
It was sort of easy to say, maybe it's not good to say or, right? And that was not a heavy, people were like, oh yeah, who would have thought that would be something a judge could do to that language? But now that we see it, got that. And so that was really, very interesting, and I was told it was helpful in the drafting. Another set of issues, though, came up around what are the potential lessons that might be lifted out of a moment in history where the outer layer of apartheid has fallen.
Yeah.
And now there's the moment of walking into these spaces in which there are additional layers of it. So, mindful of the fact that every, social historical context has its own, particularities, right? We thought that it would be useful to tell the stories around, like, what happened at Harvard when students of color showed up and people weren't yet ready to move the furniture around, right? And so at some of these spaces, we would tell the story about, law and institutions actually are multiply situated. There's like outer, inner, and the challenge is figuring out how to continue to pressure and reveal the way that law can hold up apartheid even without its formality. That was effectively what we were talking about.
So essentially employing what you employed at Harvard, this whole critical race theory lens. But I suppose that would have been very challenging because I'm thinking the end of apartheid, you're talking to predominantly white Afrikaans men, and they'd be like, hold up, what are you saying?
Even liberal, liberal, supportive of the new,
It's been
part of the party sometimes, the whole thing, right? But there was a sense that this was just America stuff.
Yeah.
And it played no role. In fact, some of the debates that we witnessed were debates about, well, we can't even call the aftermath of apartheid a racial problem here, because to call it a racial problem, you actually have to have similarly situated white people, and apartheid was so good, I guess, or bad, whatever, at what it was doing, that it didn't even have that comparison. And so the idea was that we have a class problem, not a race problem, and if you try to use race to talk about it, what was it? You'll just basically rip off the scab. And we're back to square one, and take that stuff back to where it came from. You entitled Black Americans, which inside the very statement of it is a racialized sort of thing.
Exactly.
But the fact that it wasn't heard as that was kind of, stunning to me, having come from a space in which these fights had happened. And even if people thought that, they kind of knew that saying that was just not.
And it's interesting because having come to America and having really, because one of the reasons why I did come to UCLA and in particular was lured to UCLA was the critical race specialization. I was like, I've been thinking a lot about this, but the problem with South Africa, and I would venture to say white mediocrity, is that you need to have credentials. So you can't speak about your experience because it's not enough, but you need to have learned it. So coming here has been that, to acquire these tools to be like, this has always been happening. I may not have had the language for it, now I have, because thank you to critical race scholars, we can now say this is how this is happening.
Yeah.
And also America and South Africa have really similar histories. So if Black Americans from America are saying, maybe you want to consider, they're coming from a place of, we know, we've seen it.
Yeah, well, that experience, as you said, it was in a particular moment, right? But I think there was more of a sense of South African exceptionalism, more of a sense of, we managed to work this thing out,
Without a civil war, without bloodiness.
Right. Yeah, I don't know what that, all the bodies.
Exactly.
I don't know what that meant, but there was like this commitment to it. And more times than not, what got thrown at us is we're non-racial. We're non-racial. And, here's what was so amazing about it for us. In our own struggles here around, color blindness, we would often, this was before, the transformation, before, Nelson Mandela was released. We used to say, just as a thought experiment, well, imagine what would happen in South Africa if tomorrow, right, Black South Africans finally were able, to control, the state. Would we think it made any sense to be colorblind?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And people would, it was the closer argument. People would go, oh yeah, okay. When you've had this history, of white supremacy, and it's been hardwired into the state, it doesn't make any sense to think that you're going to be able to dismantle that through race neutral colorblind.
Exactly. Yeah.
And so people got that when we talked about it. So when it actually happened, and we're really there, and people are saying exactly what
they've always said.
What was like, this is absurd, right? This is absurd. We thought, wow, the hold of the aspiration is so great that you can roll it out the day after. Like day one, apartheid. Day two, post-apartheid. We don't have race anymore. It's like, really? What makes you think that makes any sense at all?
What is interesting is that we're seeing the consequences of that conversation happen now in 2018, 2017. From 3 years ago, we've seen more explicitly than before, because it's always existed, how white people are coming out. One, in 2016, just the beginning of the year, white woman was like, oh my gosh, I'm at the beach and there are all these monkeys. That's literally what she said. 2 months later, we had a CEO or chief economist of a bank tweet about black people being entitled. We've had just recently a woman being charged of criminuria and sentenced to jail for 3 years for using the word kafir 47 times. So it is, again, it's because of that. It's because they didn't take that project seriously enough, and now we have to, in 2018, be talking about like what the purpose of apartheid is. So it's been quite enlightening coming here and interacting with you, Professor, and other professors in the critical race theory specialization, to think really about things we've always thought about, but being like, actually, this is what it is. And I think it brings a nice segue into, I think around 1994, 1995, there was a book that you edited called Critical Race Theory Key Writings. And effectively, I think that is a really important book about understanding what critical race theory is. So do you want to talk about like how you compiled, like how all this came together?
Well, yeah, that's a very interesting story because from maybe the third or fourth year in, we knew that we needed to actually create a collection of all the pieces, and we were trying to think about that in collective terms, like this should be something that the entire movement should own it. But market forces and stuff like that make it difficult to sustain that commitment. So actually, there are more than there's a couple critical race
Yes, there
theories.
is. Yes.
But this one is one that seeks to expose readers to the full treatment of the different articles. We try to historicize it somewhat, starting with some of the pre-critical race theory articles, moving to the more at the time recent ones, and internationalizing critical race theory. I think the key contribution it makes is that the introduction tries to weave a story about the conflicts and the conditions out of which critical race theory emerged as a conscious intellectual movement, and then the pieces get introduced in terms of their emergence as part of that developing consciousness.
And I think it's a really useful book, it ranges from speaking about, what integrationalism and nationalism looks like, to speaking about Black women and how they experience violence and also sterilization. And it speaks about Professor Harris's whiteness as property. So it's really foundational because it brings together these things. And I think a lot of the time people who critique scholarship like critical race theory aren't really engaging with the material.
At all.
So they're not going to engage with the material and critique the material, but this idea of what they think critical race theory is.
Same with intersectionality.
Very same with intersectionality.
Sort of people use it in a sentence 3 or 4 times and they think they know from the context what it actually is.
And I suppose I want to know, I know that 2 books are coming up, Racetrack and On Intersectionality, which is really exciting because I think that I'm particularly excited about knowing more about the wondrous mind of Professor Kimberlé Crenshaw. And I wanted to ask, this is the moment you wanted to, come and publish these books because, a lot of time has passed and now you want to be like, okay, this is what the project is. So I want to talk about, and not necessarily the content, but like the project of publishing these 2 books.
Yeah. So I have to say that, it turns out that the book on intersectionality is going to come out the 30th anniversary of demarginalizing. I'm going to own it as part of the intent, but it really wasn't. For the longest time, for a long time, publishers have really been pressing for, the collection, and the publisher I ultimately went with, which was the publisher for Critical Race Theory, has been pressing for a long time. And I did drag my feet on it for a while, in part because, the life of intersectionality has just, gone on to be so many things to so many different people. It felt to me like going to a party with a boombox listening to my own music, both in terms of the temporality, boombox, right? And the fact that there's all this other stuff and I'm still,
listening to
this. Yeah. And it took me a while to, just get okay with that, in part because it is telling a genealogy of my thinking about it, and
which
not
is important.
Trying to, do grand theory and incorporate every nuance and permutation. It's not that.
Yeah,
right?
It's about what you intended and how you've progressed.
And I just gotta hope that's okay. So that's what that's gonna be. And the racetrack is actually also historicizing a set of conversations and trainings about structural racism that unfolded prior to Obama and some during Obama. And now we're in a post-racial period. Even that has more of a, man, remember when just 10 years ago we used to talk about it this way? We don't talk about it this way anymore. Right? It's a series of lectures from my civil rights courses, structural racism trainings that the Policy Forum did at the Aspen Institute for 6 or 7 years. So they're small chapters that are basically informed by critical race theory with a target audience of lay people, not necessarily academics, not necessarily lawyers, but people who want to really understand more about the evolution of race talk through civil rights, post-civil rights, post-racialism, post-racialism. What's happening?
I suppose another question, I guess it would be remiss of me not to ask this question. What are some of the books that you hold dear to you? If I were to enter your library right now, there would be a book with some doggy ears because, you've read it so many times. What are some of those books?
Well, we mentioned some of them. Derek Bell's Race, Racism, and American Law, every edition. Ain't I a Woman? That's just sort of foundational. I go back to that all the time. The Critical Race Theory reader, because every time I do a speech, I've got to go in and get some quotes, out of that. Recently, I've been inhaling everything I can about Harriet Tubman, partly because, with the coming moment in which her face is going to be on a $20 bill, it just seemed ironic to me that a black woman who died utterly impoverished, despite the fact that she was absolutely an incredible, leader, and could only be supported through her husband's pension rather than a pension that should have been given to her for being a general and being a scout and being a spy. It just seemed to so nicely underscore the contemporary discourse about black women's economic underdevelopment and the way in which racial justice policymaking under President Obama was focused on the traditional patriarchal male-headed family with women being in a trickle-down position downstream.
And always a supportive.
And, for this to be the centerpiece of racial justice when on every other issue we've moved beyond gender binary and we've moved beyond the idea of the patriarchal center, except when it comes to racial justice. So it's been really interesting to me to kind of try to close the historical loop. So while we're lifting Harriet Tubman up and putting her on currency, let's talk about black women's dollars. Let's talk about, what are the ideological and structural, conditions under which they don't get paid. And why have we forgotten these stories? So I'm reading a fair amount of sort of 19th century race and feminism, which is just so enlightening.
And any feminism book you would recommend besides Ain't I a Woman?
Oh my God, well, sort of all of them. Let's see which one stands out the most. Actually, Toni Morrison speaks to me because, as I say, I think through narratives and pictures.
Yes.
And so pretty much every angle of an intersectional dilemma is captured
in Morrison's work.
And even the the theoretical work in which she actually says, "Yes, this was what I was doing." It's like, yeah, I thought so. Right? So I could hang out with her. I could hang out with her for a while.
Thank you very much, Professor, for this opportunity to really speak. And I want to say, because I keep referring to demystifying intersectionality, because I think it's it's gone somewhere that it has never was not supposed to go. And I think it's important to speak to people who have created the scholarship and find out, because this is what the Cheeky Native seeks to do, speak to writers who have created work to find out what their creation and what way they were thinking about work, but more importantly, to archive stories about writers, because 20 years from now, people will come back to this conversation when they encounter on intersectionality and want to find out what it looked like. And that is something that's really important to me, to have auditory archiving instead of assuming or pitching together, because it seems something that we tend to do. We'll take a piece from this and a piece of that instead of a whole conversation. So thank you very much for this opportunity.
Thank you this has been a brilliant conversation. It's been a real pleasure, and it's been so great to have you in the class this semester.